Hello everybody. How are you all? I do hope I didn't just deafen you with that clap. Sorry about that. A little bit over enthusiastic there because I've just come back from helping someone to get their car started because the battery had got flat, which is why if you were here a few minutes early, sorry, I'm in the middle of doing two things at once. Yes, I am. If you were here a few minutes ago, you would have seen across my starting soon screen that I was going to be here soon, but I was just in the middle of sorting out some vehicle issues. That's because I was helping somebody to get their car started just by going along the road with the car and the jumper leads to get it started. So, how are you all? What are you up to at the moment? How's life going for you? I hope you're somewhere where the climate is comfortable at the moment. It's a little bit warmer here for me where I live than it has been recently, just a little tiny bit, and I'm noticing it. We're actually in autumn, heading towards winter, and normally at this stage it's not quite this warm, but we'll get there. So not a problem. One of those things, just one of those things. That's how life goes. So what are we up to at the moment? We are currently reading sorry, my brain has just gone blank, and I just need to make sure that I have got my headphone sound turned off. And the easiest way to do that is to actually just make sure that the physical button that's on it, the volume button on it, is turned all the way down. That's the safest thing to do. And make sure that my phone has got its sound turned off. Yes, that is okay. Oh, the notification sound was off, but the volume sound wasn't, which meant that if anything was going on, such as me making it possible to keep an eye on my stream by having the stream open in the background, you would have heard me chatting to myself, and you would have been hearing triplicate or duplicate or something like that, and it would have been very confusing. So not a problem, we've got that one sorted out. See, I've got my monitoring over here on my phone so I can see what's going on. So back to what are we up to? What are we currently up to? We are currently up to reading the last two chapters of Emily of New Moon. I'm pretty sure it's the last two chapters. I'm just going to have a look. Yes, the last two chapters, and hopefully they're not too long and I can actually read both of them today, but we'll see how we go. Okay, trying to get my book propped up so that my iPad mini first generation propped up so that I can actually see it without having to hold on to it, and because of holding on to it, leaning on the desk, which makes the whole camera and everything else jump around. So, I think that's about it. What am I about to do? I am just looking on my other monitor to make sure there's nothing weirdo happening there that I need to be aware of. No, that's going okay, which is fabulous. I'm so delighted with that. I'm looking at my camera, and my camera is working because I could see it on my on my display here. My microphone is working, which is good. Otherwise, I would hope that you would actually type into the chat and say your microphone's not working, or if it's doing weird audio things, you would let me know. Please do. I'm not too worried about looking silly. I do that quite easily. I'd rather know that there's something going on than be left ignorant and have you guys having to put up with it. Anyway, so introduction for anyone who's new here. Hi, I'm Jev. I read old-fashioned children's stories because why not? Actually, because I grew up reading them, thoroughly enjoyed them, and I discovered that a lot of my understanding of the world had been extended because of the books I had grown up reading. And so I want to share that opportunity with other people. You don't have to read them when you're a kid. You can read them as an adult. You can listen to them as an adult. So that's what we do. We read them out loud and people listen to them. They listen to them live on Twitch, which is where I'm broadcasting to. And if you wish to actually participate in the chat with me, then you need to be watching it live on Twitch, so you can type in to the chat box there. I also transfer the saved recordings across to YouTube and put them into playlists there. I remove everything outside of basically where my hands are at the moment, so that all you have is the video window. There's no overlay, there's no chat, there's nothing else like that. You don't need all those things over on YouTube because you can't actually interact with that level of chat. But one of the advantages of YouTube is that if you wish to make a comment for me, you can leave a comment underneath the video, which is why they're not actually classified as for kids, because the YouTube usage terms of service thingy says that if you're doing things for kids, they don't enable comments. So whichever way you watch them, that's cool. I'm all good with it. I do also have friends who can't be listening at the time when I'm reading, who will catch up watching VODs. That's the video on demand, saved videos on Twitch before they disappear after 2 weeks. And always work really well, although I'm always delighted if I have a few people involved while I'm actually reading live. It just, I don't know, somehow it just feels a bit more real. A couple of bits of information. Some people have asked me, how do you describe what you do? And they have assumed that it's like listening to an audiobook. Very obviously, if you're listening to this at the moment, this is not like an audiobook, because audio narrators do not chat with their listeners. Also, I have a tendency to get lost on the page or mispronounce things. My accents are absolutely horrendous, and I'm not doing, as far as I can, I'm trying not to use accents while I'm reading this book, because I can't do a Canadian accent. Itchy nose. Can't do an American accent either. And they're not consistent. None of my accents are very consistent at all. They tend to just sort of waft through different sets of sounds, which is a lot of fun actually. And I'm quite happy if you laugh when I get lost on the page or anything like that. Sometimes we will discover something together. There'll be a word that I might be familiar with but am not absolutely certain, and I want to share the understanding of what it is with you, the listeners. And so I'll pause what I'm actually reading and ask somebody if they wouldn't mind looking it up, and they'll type it into the chat and I will read out the definition for you, so that you have that. It gives you a bigger understanding of what you're listening to. There are other things like that I do where, because of the life experiences I have, and you can see from this grey hair, which is totally natural, well, apart from the bit that's slightly lighter brown because it had a bit of bleach and had some weird colour in it. Apart from that, it's all genuine greys. As you can see, I have a lot of life experience, and because of that, and because of my reading a lot of old-fashioned stories when I was growing up and continuing to read a wide variety of books as I was over the years, often there will be stuff that's part of a story which I will understand the implications of, or the meaning of, or the purpose of, which I realise that people who are listening don't necessarily understand because they haven't had that same range of experiences. And so I will often interrupt myself and explain something while we're listening to a story. If there's something I mention in the story that you're not sure of, write it in the chat. Or if you're watching on YouTube, write it in the comments, and either myself or somebody else who's watching will actually, at some stage, no guarantee when, but at some stage we'll probably explain it for you. 3 tips for new people here while I'm reading. Make sure you have something to drink, Water is brilliant. It keeps your brain working. This is my water bottle, although I usually drink actually out of a glass drinking cup with a straw these days, so I don't have to wave the end of the drinking bottle at you. So first point is have something to drink with you, ready to go. And if you haven't got it, rush off and go and get it now, but not until I have said the second one, which is make sure you have something to eat, something to snack on, something to drink, something to eat, and somewhere comfortable to sit. So here's something to eat. Today I have, let's see if my cheese is going to go green. Today I have cheese and crackers with a little bit of persimmon chutney. It's yummy. And somewhere comfortable to sit. That's your last instruction. Or kind of your last instruction, because it's something that I always forget to say until partway through the story. And it's a good idea. Well, I found it's a good idea, and I often do it, and I'm the person reading, to have a pen or pencil and paper handy, because if there's something that comes up when we're reading that you're not sure of and you want to stay focused on the story rather than doing a little bit of Googling for yourself, write those things down on your pen and paper, or on your paper with your pen or pencil or whatever you want to use, bit of burnt stick, I don't care, lipstick, crayons, find something to write with, and then you can look it up later on and expand your understanding even further. So, I've also got something else to drink. I've got my coffee. And the weather is cool enough, kind of, for me to actually be having warm coffee instead of cold coffee. So, with all of that said, how about we get on with reading? And yes, if you see me looking across over here, that is usually because I am checking what's going on my other monitor in case there's something I need to act on. So, and I'm trying to look at you in the eyes. That's my camera right up there. Although sometimes I don't actually tend to make eye contact. I'm sorry about that. Anyway, we'll see how we get on. Here we go. Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery, which is the lady who wrote the Anne of Green Gables series of books. Most famous for that. And we are reading chapter 30, called When the Curtain Lifted. Curtain? She's talked about a curtain before, and I think that was to do with somebody dying. I hope that's not what this is today. We'll see. Here we go. Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery, chapter 30, When the Curtain Lifted. It would be pleasant to be able to record that after the reconciliation in the Lookout, Emily and Aunt Elizabeth lived in entire amity and harmony. Yes, our last chapter, Aunt Elizabeth had done something almost unforgivable. She had read through Emily's private writings and had been offended at what was said about herself. Not understanding that it was Emily's way of processing intense feelings about things as she would write about it. And then after that, she actually felt okay, and so it didn't stick with her. And Aunt Elizabeth didn't understand this and was quite offended. And Emily bit right back and told her it was completely inappropriate for Aunt Elizabeth to have done that. And then they all went off and did their own thing for a while, and Emily got all upset and cried and things like this. I don't know that Aunt Elizabeth did, but anyway. And both of them came to the conclusion that they had been too harsh, and so each had sought forgiveness of the other. So this is the reference here. It would be pleasant to be able to record that after the reconciliation in the Lookout, Emily and Aunt Elizabeth lived in entire amity and harmony. But the truth was that things went on pretty much the same as before. Their personalities are so different. Emily went softly and tried to mingle serpent's wisdom and dove's harmlessness in practical proportions, but their points of view were so different that there were bound to be clashes. They did not speak the same language, so there was bound to be misunderstanding. The language of the heart, that's the different languages. They both speak English. And yet There was a difference in how they got on, a very vital difference. Elizabeth Murray had learned an important lesson. There was not one law of fairness for children and another for grown-ups. Because that's one of the points that Emily had made, is that if I was an adult, you would not have done this to me. This would not have been appropriate. So why are you doing it to me? Anyway, we'll carry on. She continued to be as autocratic as ever, but she did not do or say to Emily anything she would not have done or said to Laura had occasion called for it. That is actually a huge change. Emily, on her side, had discovered the fact that under all her surface coldness and sternness, Aunt Elizabeth really had an affection for her, and it was wonderful what a difference this made. It took the sting out of Aunt Elizabeth's ways and words and healed entirely a certain little half-conscious sore spot that had been in Emily's heart ever since the incident of the drawn slips at Maywood. Emily's father had died. The family had got together, this is Emily's mother's family, because Emily's mother had died a long time ago, had got together to make the decision as to who Emily was going to live with and be raised by, and they had drawn lots. Well, actually, they had all submitted their little token, and Emily had had to pick one of the straws, and she'd ended up with Aunt Elizabeth, which is quite hurtful, really. But I don't think any of the adults actually thought that one through. And she knew that openly there were several of the relatives who did not want to have her with them and also did not like her. And now she has discovered that maybe Aunt Elizabeth has a little bit more affection for her after all. I don't believe I'm a duty to Aunt Elizabeth any more, she thought exultantly. Emily grew rapidly that summer in body, mind and soul. Life was delightful, growing richer every hour like an unfolding rose. Forms of beauty filled her imagination and were transferred as best she could to paper, though they were never so lovely there, and Emily had the heart-breaking moments of the true artist who discovers that, and I quote, "Never on painter's canvas lives the charm of his fancy's dream." There you go. The idea you have in your head and then what you manage to get down on paper are often very different. Much of her old stuff she burned. Even The Child of the Sea was reduced to ashes. That was a story or a poem she had been writing. But the little pile of manuscripts in the mantel cupboard of the Lookout was growing steadily larger. Emily kept her scribblings there now. Now the Lookout is her own bedroom, which used to be her mother's. And she's gained it since she came back from her great-aunt's house. Emily kept her scribblings there now. The sofa shelf in the garret was desecrated, because that's where Aunt Elizabeth had found her writings. And besides, she felt somehow that Aunt Elizabeth would never meddle with her private papers again. No matter where they were kept, she did not go now to the garret to read or write or dream. Her own dear Lookout was the best place for her. She loved that quaint little old room intensely. It was almost like a living thing to her, a sharer in gladness, a comfort in sorrow. Ilse was growing too, blossoming out into strange beauty and brilliance, knowing no law but her own pleasure, recognizing no authority but her own whim. Aunt Laura worried over her. She'll be a woman so soon, and who will look after her? Alan won't. Alan is Ilse's father, who apparently loathes her, and it's something to do with her mother, who is not part of her life, and we don't know what the answer to that is yet. "I have no patience with Alan," said Aunt Elizabeth grimly. "He is always ready to hector and advise other people. He'd better look at home. He'll come over here and order me to do this or that, or not do it, for Emily. But if I say one word to him about Ilse, he blows the roof off." Sorry. Dry throat. I've done a lot of talking today. I'm just going to get one of my throat lozenges out. And I'll keep reading, but hopefully not make too many rattly noises. If I say one word to him about Ilse, he blows the roof off. The idea of a man turning against his daughter and neglecting her as he has neglected Ilse simply because her mother wasn't all she ought to be. As if the poor child was to blame for that. Shh, said Aunt Laura as Emily crossed the sitting room on her way upstairs. Obviously there's something that happened with Ilse's mother that Ilse's father was highly offended or hurt by, but also it was considered in the old-fashioned society that Aunt Elizabeth is living from inappropriate to talk about with children, even though she's 12 years old. Emily smiled sadly to herself. Aunt Laura needn't be shushing. There was nothing left for her to find out about Ilse's mother, nothing except the most important thing of all, which neither she nor anybody else living knew. For Emily had never surrendered her conviction that the whole truth about Beatrice Burnley, that's Ilse's mother, was not known. She often worried about it when she lay curled up in her black walnut bed of nights, listening to the moan of the Gulf, that's the sea out beyond the edge of the island, and the wind woman singing in the trees, and drifted into sleep, wishing intensely that she could solve the dark old mystery and dissolve its legend of shame and bitterness. Emily went rather languidly upstairs to the lookout. She meant to write some more of her story, The Ghost of the Well, wherein she was weaving the old legend of the well in the lee field, but somehow interest was lacking. She put the manuscript back into the mantel cupboard. She read over a letter from Dean Priest which had come that day, one of his fat, jolly, whimsical, delightful letters, wherein he had told her that he was coming to stay a month with his sister at Blairwater. She wondered why this announcement did not excite her more. She was tired, her head was aching. Emily couldn't remember ever having had a headache before. Since she could not write, she decided to lie down and be Lady Trevanion for a while. Emily was Lady Trevanion very often that summer, in one of the dream lives she had begun to build up for herself. Lady Trevanion was the wife of an English earl, and besides being a famous novelist, was a member of the British House of Commons, where she always appeared in black velvet with a stately coronet of pearls on her dark hair. She was the only woman in the house, and as this was before the days of the suffragettes, she had to endure many sneers and innuendos and insults from the ungallant males around her. Emily's favourite dream scene was where she rose to make her first speech, a wonderfully thrilling event. As Emily found it difficult to do justice to the scene in any ideas of her own, she always fell back on Pitt's reply to Walpole, which she had found in her royal reader, and declaimed it with suitable variations. The insolent speaker who had provoked Lady Trevanion into speech had sniggered at her as a woman, and Lady Trevanion, a magnificent creature in her velvet and pearls, rose to her feet amid hushed and dramatic silence, and said, "The atrocious crime of being a woman which the honourable member has, with such spirit and decency, charged upon me, I shall attempt neither to palliate nor deny, but shall content myself with wishing that I may be one of those whose follies cease with their sex, and not one of that number who are ignorant in spite of manhood and experience." That's quite a bit of a put down, actually. Here she was always interrupted by thunders of applause in the imagination. But the savour was entirely lacking in this scene today, and by the time Emily had reached the line, "But womanhood, sir, is not my only crime," she gave up in disgust and fell to worrying over Ilse's mother again, mixed up with some uneasy speculations regarding the climax of her story about the ghost in the well, mingled with her unpleasant physical sensations, because she's got this headache. Her eyes hurt her when she moved them. Sorry, itchy nose. Her eyes hurt her when she moved them. She was chilly, though the July day was hot. She was still lying there when Aunt Elizabeth came up to ask why she hadn't gone in to bring the cows home from the pasture. I didn't know it was so late, said Emily confusedly. My head aches, Aunt Elizabeth. Aunt Elizabeth rolled up the white cotton blind and looked at Emily. She noted her flushed face. She felt her pulse. Then she bade her shortly to stay where she was, went down, and sent Perry, that's the boy that is a friend of Emily's and works there, sent Perry for Dr. Burnley. "Probably she's got the measles," said the doctor as gruffly as usual. Emily was not yet sick enough to be gentle over. "There's an outbreak of them at Derry Pond. Has she had any chance to catch them?" Jimmy Joe Bell's 2 children were here one afternoon about 10 days ago. She played with them. She's always playing around with people she's no business to associate with. I haven't heard that they were or have been sick, though. Jimmy Joe Bell, when asked plainly, confessed that his young ones had come out with measles the very day after they had been at New Moon. There was therefore not much doubt as to Emily's malady. "It is a bad kind of measles, apparently," the doctor said. "Quite a number of the Derry Pond children have died of it. Mostly French, though. The kids would be out of bed when they had no business to be, and caught cold. I don't think you need worry about Emily. She might as well have measles and be done with it. Keep her warm and keep the room dark. I'll run over in the morning." For 3 or 4 days nobody was much alarmed. Measles was a disease everybody had to have. This is before the days of vaccinations for them. Aunt Elizabeth looked after Emily well and slept on a sofa which had been moved into the lookout. She even left the window open at night, because Emily sleeps with the window open, but Aunt Elizabeth doesn't usually. Sorry, I have to find the right place. In spite of this, perhaps Aunt Elizabeth thought because of it, Emily grew steadily sicker, and on the 5th day a sharp change for the worse took place. Her fever went up rapidly. Delirium set in. Dr. Burnley came, looked anxious, scowled, changed the medicine. I'm sent to a bad case of pneumonia at White Cross," he said, "and I have to go to Charlottetown in the morning to be present at Mrs. Jackwell's operation. I promised her I would go. I'll be back in the evening. Emily is very restless. That high-strung system of hers is evidently very sensitive to fever. What's that nonsense she's talking about the wind woman?" "Oh, I don't know," said Aunt Elizabeth worriedly. "She's always talking nonsense like that, even when she's well. Ellen, tell me plainly, is there any danger?" "There's always danger in this type of measles. I don't like these symptoms. The eruption should be out by now, and there's no sign of it." That's the showing of the rash. "Her fever is very high, but I don't think we need be alarmed yet. If I thought otherwise, I wouldn't go to town. Keep her as quiet as possible. Humour her whims if you can. I don't like that mental disturbance. She looks terribly distressed, seems to be worrying over something. Has she had anything on her mind of late?" "Not that I know of," said Aunt Elizabeth. She had a sudden bitter realization that she really did not know much about the child's mind. Emily would never have come to her with any of her little troubles and worries. "Emily, what is bothering you?" asked Dr. Burnley softly, very softly. He took the hot, tossing little hand gently, oh, so gently, in his big one. Emily looked up with wild, fever-bright eyes. "She couldn't have done it. She couldn't have done it." "Of course she couldn't," said the doctor cheerily. "Don't worry. She didn't do it." His eyes telegraphed, "What does she mean?" to Elizabeth, but Elizabeth shook her head. "Who are you talking about, dear?" she asked Emily. It was the first time she had called Emily dear. But Emily was off on another tack. The well in Mr. Lee's field was open, she declared. Someone would be sure to fall into it. Why didn't Mr. Lee shut it up? Dr. Burnley left Aunt Elizabeth trying to reassure Emily on that point and hurried away to White Cross. At the door he nearly fell over Perry, who was curled up on the sandstone slab, hugging his sunburned legs desperately. "How is Emily?" he demanded, grasping the skirt of the doctor's coat. "Don't bother me, I'm in a hurry," growled the doctor. "You tell me how Emily is, or I'll hang on to your coat till the seams go," said Perry stubbornly. "I can't get one word of sense out of them old maids. You tell me." "She's a sick child, but I'm not seriously alarmed about her yet." The doctor gave his coat another tug, but Perry held on for a last word. "You've got to cure her," he said. "If anything happens to Emily, I'll drown myself in the pond. Mind that." He let go so suddenly that Dr. Burnley nearly went headlong on the ground. Then Perry curled up on the doorstep again. He watched there until Laura and Cousin Jimmy had gone to bed, and then he sneaked through the house and sat on the stairs, where he could hear any sound in Emily's room. He sat there all night, with his fists clenched as if keeping guard against an unseen foe. Elizabeth Murray watched by Emily until 2 o'clock, and then Laura took her place. "She has raved a great deal," said Aunt Elizabeth. "I wish I knew what is worrying her. There is something, I feel sure. It isn't all mere delirium. She keeps repeating, she couldn't have done it, in such imploring tones. I wonder, oh Laura, you remember the time I read her letters? Do you think she means me?" Laura shook her head. She had never seen Elizabeth so moved. "If the child doesn't get better," said Aunt Elizabeth. She said no more, but went quickly out of the room. Laura sat down by the bed. She was pale and drawn with her own worry and fatigue, for she had not been able to sleep. She loved Emily as her own child, and the awful dread that had possessed her heart would not lift for an instant. She sat there and prayed mutely. Emily fell into a troubled slumber which lasted until the grey dawn crept into the lookout. Then she opened her eyes and looked at Aunt Laura, looked through her, looked beyond her. "I see her coming over the fields," she said in a high, clear voice. She is coming so gladly. She is singing. She is thinking of her baby. Oh, keep her back. Keep her back. She doesn't see the well. It is so dark she doesn't see it. Oh, she's gone into it. She's gone into it." Emily's voice rose in a piercing shriek which penetrated to Aunt Elizabeth's room and brought her flying across the hall in her flannel nightgown. "What is wrong, Laura?" she gasped. Laura was trying to soothe Emily, who was struggling to sit up in bed. Her cheeks were crimson and her eyes had the same far, wild look. Emily, darling." Emily, darling, you've just had a bad dream. The old Lee well isn't open. Nobody has fallen into it." "Yes, somebody has," said Emily shrilly. "She has. I saw her, with the ace of hearts on her forehead. Do you think I don't know her?" She fell back on her pillow, moaned, and tossed the hands which Laura Murray had loosened in her surprise. The two ladies of New Moon looked at each other across her bed in dismay, and something like terror. "Who did you see, Emily?" asked Aunt Elizabeth. "Ilse's mother, of course. I always knew she didn't do that dreadful thing. She fell into the old well. She's there now. Go, and get her out. Aunt Laura, please." Yes, of course, we'll get her out, darling," said Aunt Laura soothingly. Emily sat up in bed and looked at Aunt Laura again. This time she did not look through her. She looked into her. Laura Murray felt that those burning eyes read her soul. "You are lying to me," cried Emily. "You don't mean to try and get her out. You are only saying it to put me off." Aunt Elizabeth, she suddenly turned and caught Aunt Elizabeth's hand. You'll do it for me, won't you? You'll go and get her out of the old well, won't you? Elizabeth remembered that Dr. Burnley had said that Emily's whims must be humoured. She was terrified by the child's condition. Yes, I'll get her out if she is in there, she said. Emily released her hand and sank down. The wild glare left her eyes. A sudden, great calm fell over her anguished little face. I know you'll keep your word, she said. You are very hard, but you never lie, Aunt Elizabeth. Elizabeth Murray went back to her own room and dressed herself with her shaking fingers. A little later, when Emily had fallen into a quiet sleep, Laura went downstairs and heard Elizabeth giving Cousin Jimmy some orders in the kitchen. Elizabeth, you don't really mean to have that old well searched? I do, said Elizabeth resolutely. I know it's nonsense as well as you do, but I had to promise it to quiet her down, and I'll keep my promise. You heard what she said. She believed I wouldn't lie to her, nor will I. Jimmy, you will go over to James Lee's after breakfast and ask him to come here. How has she heard the story? Said Laura. I don't know. Oh, someone has told her, of course. Perhaps that old demon of a Nancy Priest. It doesn't matter who. She has heard it, and the thing is to keep her quiet. It isn't so much of a job to put ladders in the well and get someone to go down it. The thing that matters is the absurdity of it. We'll be laughed at for a pair of fools, protested Laura, whose share of Murray pride was in hot revolt. And besides, it will open up all the old scandal again. No matter, I'll keep my word to the child, said Elizabeth stubbornly. Alan Burnley came to New Moon at sunset on his way home from town. He was tired, for he had been going night and day for over a week. He was more worried than he had admitted over Emily. He looked old and rather desolate as he stepped into the New Moon kitchen. Only Cousin Jimmy was there. Cousin Jimmy did not seem to have much to do, although it was a good hay day, and Jimmy Joe Bell and Perry were hauling in the great fragrant sun-dried loads. He sat by the western window with a strange expression on his face. Hello, Jimmy. Where are the girls? And how is Emily? Emily is better, said Cousin Jimmy. The rash is out and her fever has gone down. I think she's asleep. Good. We can't afford to lose that little girl, could we, Jimmy? No, said Jimmy, but he didn't seem to want to talk about it. Laura and Elizabeth are in the sitting room. They want to see you. He paused a minute and then added in an eerie way, There is nothing hidden that shall not be revealed. It occurred to Alan Burnley that Jimmy was acting mysteriously, and if Laura and Elizabeth wanted to see him, why didn't they come out? It wasn't like them to stand on ceremony in this fashion. He pushed open the sitting-room door impatiently. Laura Murray was sitting on the sofa, leaning her head on its arm. He could not see her face, but he felt that she was crying. Elizabeth was sitting bolt upright on a chair. She wore her second-best black silk and her second-best lace cap, and she, too, had been crying. Dr. Burnley never attached much importance to Laura's tears, easy as those of most women, but that Elizabeth Murray should cry, had he ever seen her cry before? The thought of Ilse flashed into his mind, his little neglected daughter. Had anything happened to Ilse? In one dreadful moment, Alan Burnley paid the price of his treatment of his child. "What is wrong?" he exclaimed in his gruffest manner. "Oh, Alan," said Elizabeth Murray, "God forgive us! God forgive us all!" "It is Ilse," said Dr. Burnley dully. No, not Ilse." Then she told him. She told him what had been found at the bottom of the old Lee well. She told him what had been the real fate of the lovely, laughing young wife whose name for 12 bitter years had never crossed his lips. It was not until the next evening that Emily saw the doctor. She was lying in bed, weak and limp, red as a beet with the measles rash, but quite herself again. Alan Burnley stood by the bed and looked down at her. "Emily, dear little child, do you know what you have done for me? God knows how you did it." "I thought you didn't believe in God," said Emily wonderingly. "You have given me back my faith in him, Emily." "Why? What have I done?" Dr. Burnley saw that she had no remembrance of her delirium. Laura had told him that she had slept long and soundly after Elizabeth's promise, and had awakened with fever gone and the eruption fast coming out. She had asked nothing, and they had said nothing. "When you are better, we will tell you all," he said, smiling down at her. There was something very sorrowful in the smile, and yet something very sweet. "He is smiling with his eyes as well as his mouth now," thought Emily, because that had been her observation of him previously, is that he smiled with his mouth but never his eyes. How did she know?" asked Laura to him when he went down. I can't understand it, Alan." "No, nor I. These things are beyond us, Laura," he answered gravely. "I only know this child has given Beatrice back to me, stainless and beloved. It can be explained rationally enough, perhaps. Emily has evidently been told about Beatrice and worried over it. Her repeated, 'She couldn't have done it,' shows that, and the tales of the old Lee well naturally made a deep impression on the mind of a sensitive child, keenly alive to dramatic values. In her delirium she mixed all this up with the well-known fact of Jimmy's tumble into the New Moon well, and the rest was coincidence. I would have explained it all so myself once, but now, Laura, I can only say humbly, a little child shall lead them." "Our stepmother's mother was a Highland Scotchwoman. They said she had the second sight." Oops, sorry, let's try that again because I didn't know who was speaking. "Our stepmother's mother was a Highland Scotchwoman. They said she had the second sight," said Elizabeth. "I never believed in it before." The excitement of Blair Water had died away before Emily was deemed strong enough to hear the story. That which had been found in the old Lee well had been buried in the Mitchell plot at Shrewsbury, and a white marble shaft sacred to the memory of Beatrice Burnley, beloved wife of Alan Burnley, had been erected. The sensation caused by Dr. Burnley's presence every Sunday in the old Burnley pew had died away. On the first evening that Emily was allowed to sit up, Aunt Laura told her the whole story. Her manner of telling stripped it forever of the taint and innuendo left by Aunt Nancy. "I knew Ilse's mother couldn't have done it," said Emily triumphantly. "We blame ourselves now for our lack of faith," said Aunt Laura. "We should have known too, but it did seem black against her at the time, Emily. She was a bright, beautiful, merry creature. We thought her close friendship with her cousin natural and harmless. We now know it was so. But all these years since her disappearance, we have believed differently. Mr. James Lee remembers clearly that the well was open the night of Beatrice's disappearance. His hired man had taken the old rotten planks off it that evening, intending to put new ones on it at once. Then Robert Grierson's house caught fire, and he ran with everybody else to save it. By the time it was out, it was too dark to finish with the well, and the man said nothing about it until the morning. Mr. Lee was angry with him. He said it was a scandalous thing to leave a well uncovered like that. He went right down and put the new planks in place himself. He did not look down into the well." Had he looked, he could have seen nothing, for the ferns growing out from the sides screened the depths. It was just after harvest. No one was in the field again before the next spring. He never connected Beatrice's disappearance with the open well. He wonders now that he didn't. But you see, dear, there had been much malicious gossip, and Beatrice was known to have gone on board the Lady of the Winds. That was a sailing ship that had been there, and everyone had assumed that she had run away on the ship. Beatrice was known to have gone on board the Lady of the Winds. It was taken for granted she never came off again, but she did, and went to her death in the old Lee field. It was a dreadful ending to her bright young life, but not so dreadful after all as what we believed. For 12 years we have wronged the dead. But, Emily, how could you know? I don't know. When the doctor came in that day, I don't remember anything, but now it seems to me that I remember something, just as if I'd dreamed it, of seeing Ilse's mother coming over the fields singing. It was dark, and yet I could see the Ace of Hearts. So that was a mark that she had on her face. Oh, Auntie, I don't know. I don't like to think of it some way. We won't talk of it again, said Aunt Laura gently. It is one of the things best not talked of, one of God's secrets. And Ilse, does her father love her now? Asked Emily eagerly. Love her? He can't love her enough. It seems as if he were pouring out on her at once all the shut-up love of those 12 years. He'll likely spoil her now as much with indulgence as he did before with neglect, said Elizabeth, coming in with Emily's supper in time to hear Laura's reply. It will take a lot of love to spoil Ilse, laughed Laura. She's drinking it up like a thirsty sponge, and she loves him wildly in return. There isn't a trace of grudge in her over his long neglect. All the same, said Elizabeth grimly, tucking pillows behind Emily's back with a very gentle hand, oddly in contrast with her severe expression, he won't get off so easily. Ilse has run wild for 12 years. He won't find it so easy to make her behave properly now, if he ever does. Love will do wonders, said Aunt Laura softly. Of course, Ilse is dying to come and see you, Emily, but she must wait till there is no danger of infection. I told her she might write, but when she found I would have to read it because of your eyes, she said she'd wait till you could read it yourself. Evidently, Laura laughed again, evidently Ilse has much of importance to tell you. I didn't know anybody could be as happy as I am now, said Emily. And oh, Aunt Elizabeth, it is so nice to feel hungry again and to have something to chew. And that's the end of that chapter. Have you ever been ill enough that you have lost your appetite and you haven't eaten for long enough, or if you have, it's not actually been chewing eating, it's been things like drinking soup, eating soup and that sort of thing, where it's really nice to actually have solid food in your mouth that requires you to chew it. I have. It's quite a different feeling to what you're used to. Anyway, so now since we're between chapters, I'm going to have something to eat, and I'm going to turn off my microphone because it's going to be noisy. Right, there you go. I didn't deafen you with the crackers. Right, are we ready to carry on reading? Sorry, once again, itchy nose. And no, I have not been playing with the cat, so it's not his intensely fluffy fur. We have a cat, and the cat appears to be, that's my daughter's cat actually, I'm just going to chat now before I actually start reading. The cat appears to be part Maine Coon, and the thing with Maine Coon cats is that their fluff is very intense. So they have long hairs that are quite strong. They don't feel soft. Some cats, that's the main fluff that they have. And then on top of that, as well as that, on top, as well as that, he has very, very fine underfur. It's referred to as, I think, I'm just looking for a good picture to show you. There was one here I was thinking of showing you. This one here. And I need to resize it so you can see it without it being so big that all you can see is the cat's nose or something. Here we go. Here's the cat. As you can see, he's quite fluffy. This is Theodore. This is Theodore the cat, who has his own Instagram page and also Facebook account. He hasn't posted for a long time on Instagram, but he does get tagged in people's posts. So he's fluffy, and the fluff, you can't quite make it out there, is very, 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 very fine and slightly wiggly, which is quite intriguing actually. But it does mean that sometimes you get this wafts of little bits of fluff that if you've been near him or patting him or anything like that, you end up wearing without even realizing that you are. And they can, because they're so fine, you don't necessarily, it's not like a piece of normal human hair where you've got a piece of hair's fallen out of your head and has landed on your face or shoulder or something, and you feel it, and then when you put your hand to where you can feel it, you actually are able to pick up this piece of hair and go, oh, that's what it was that was tickling me. And you can feel the hair between your fingers. His hair, his fluff, the soft fluff, is so fine that you can't just find it and pick it up. You actually have to look with a mirror up really, really close to be able to see it, to be able to pick it up. It's so soft. But it also means that he stays a lot warmer in wintertime than a lot of other cats do. And I think, I wouldn't be surprised, but I'm not certain, that Maine Coon cats originally were cats brought over on ships from Europe to the state of Maine in the States, in America, and lived basically with the people that had brought them for many, many, many years, many, many cat generations, and they actually ended up developing into their own variety of cat. Now, I wouldn't be surprised, because of the similarities, if Maine Coon cats are originally descended from Norwegian forest cats. They have some very strong similarities. They're not the same cat, they are actually different, but both of them have this really intense fur. So you have long, strong hairs in their fur, and then mixed in with those are what they call this undercoat, which is made out of this very, very soft, very fine, and often a little bit wiggly, like frizzy, but not frizzy, other layer of hair. And there's a lot of these hairs, and so therefore it would mean that if they are wild cats living in forests, out in barns, whatever like that they would actually stay warm enough to survive the winters and things like this. It also means that they're able to cope with sitting in cold conditions better, because they actually will often wrap their tail around so that their toes don't get cold. And when they sleep at night, they'll often put a paw over their nose or curl up enough that their tail can go over their feet and their nose. A survival thing. But this random fluff sometimes lands on you, especially if you've been cuddling the cat, and it sits there and it tickles, and it really tickles, and you have to do something about it. So I'm apologising and saying that's not what it is this time. You've got way too much information, but hey, that's all right. You now know it wasn't the cat that gave me the itchy nose this time. So we are going to read the last chapter of Emily of New Moon by L.M. Montgomery, and the chapter is chapter 31, Emily's Great Moment. And here we go. Emily's convalescence was rather slow. Physically, she recovered with normal celerity, but a certain spiritual and emotional languor persisted for a time. One cannot go down to the depths of hidden things and escape the penalty. Aunt Elizabeth said she moped, but Emily was too happy and contented to mope. It was just that life seemed to have lost its savour for a time, as if some spring of vital energy had been drained out of it and refilled slowly. Reality is, that is often how it is. After you've been crook for a while, especially if you've had a rather intense experience with it, it can take a long time to pick up again. Sorry. She had just then no one to play with. Perry, Ilse and Teddy had all come down with measles the same day. Mrs. Kent at first declared bitterly that Teddy had caught them at New Moon, but all three had contracted them at a Sunday school picnic where Derry Pond children had been. That's another one of the local villages or towns. That picnic infected all Blairwater. There was a perfect orgy of measles. Teddy and Ilse were only moderately ill, but Perry, who had insisted on going home to Aunt Tom at the first symptoms, nearly died. Emily was not allowed to know his danger until it had passed, lest it worry her too much. Even Aunt Elizabeth worried over it. She was surprised to discover how much they missed Perry around the place. Aunt Elizabeth really wasn't that keen on having him there, but he does help cousin Jimmy, and so she has tolerated having him there, but not realised how much she has actually appreciated him being there. Now she's finding out. It was fortunate for Emily that Dean Priest was in Blairwater during this forlorn time. His companionship was just what she needed, and helped her wonderfully on the road to complete recovery. They went for long walks together all over Blairwater, with Tweed, that's his dog, woofing around them, and explored places and roads Emily had never seen before. Now, Dean Priest is one of the older generation women of the Murray family had married into the Priest family, and the Priest family are equally proud of themselves, and they live in one of these other villages. And Dean is the unmarried young chap. He's in his 20s, I think, maybe a bit older than that, but he has a bit of a slight hunchback and a limp, and I'm not quite sure why. I think it's something to do with how he was born. But he's basically been shunned by a lot of people, but he has a lot broader understanding of the world and a lot more of an inquiring mind than most of the others locally have, especially those who are of these two proud families. But this is who he is, and when Emily had gone and stayed with Great Aunt Nancy, she had met him and got on really well with him. And so he's come over to stay with one of his sisters who lives in Blairwater, and spending time with Emily. They went for long walks together all over Blairwater, with Tweed woofing around them, and explored places and roads Emily had never seen before. They watched a young moon grow old, night by night. So that means it's quite quite a bit of time passing. They talked in dim, scented chambers of twilight, over long red roads of mystery. They followed the lure of hill winds. They saw the stars rise, and Dean told her all about them, the great constellations of the old myths. It was a wonderful month, but on the first day of Teddy's convalescence, Emily was off to the tansy patch for the afternoon, and Jevvv priest walked, if he walked at all, alone. Jevvv has been the nickname for him, and I'm not quite sure where it comes from. It's probably something to do with the fact that he has this humpback. Aunt Elizabeth was extremely polite to him, though she did not like the priests of Priest Pond overmuch, and never felt quite comfortable under the mocking gleam of Jevvv's green eyes and the faint derision of his smile, which seemed to make Murray pride and Murray traditions seem much less important than they really were. "He has the priest flavour," she told Aunt Laura, "though it isn't as strong in him as in most of them, and he's certainly helping Emily. She has begun to spunk up since he came." Emily continued to spunk up, in other words, gain energy and liveliness, and by September, when the measles epidemic was spent and Dean Priest had gone on one of his sudden swoops over to Europe for the autumn, she was ready for school again, a little taller, a little thinner, a little less childlike, with great grey shadowy eyes that looked into death and read the riddle of a buried thing, and henceforth would hold in them some haunting, elusive remembrance of that world behind the veil. Dean Priest had seen it. Mr. Carpenter saw it when she smiled at him across her desk at school. Mr. Carpenter's the newer teacher. "She's left the childhood of her soul behind, though she's still a childhood in body," he muttered. One afternoon, amid the golden days and hazes of October, he asked her gruffly to let him see some of her verses. "Sorry, just trying to get comfortable. I never meant to encourage you in it," he said. "I don't mean it now. Probably you can't write a line of real poetry, and never will. But let me see your stuff. If it's hopelessly bad, I'll tell you so. I won't have you wasting years striving for the unattainable. At least I won't have it on my conscience if you do." We did actually learn that he had literary aspirations which were knocked back. So that's why he doesn't want her wasting her time on it if it's inappropriate, but he actually has some skills. "If there's any promise in it, I'll tell you so just as honestly. And bring some of your stories too. They're trash yet, that's certain, but I'll see if they show just and sufficient cause for going on." Emily spent a very solemn hour that evening, weighing, choosing, rejecting. To the little bundle of verse she added one of her Jimmy books, which contained, as she thought, her best stories. She went to school next day so secret and mysterious that Ilse took offence, started in to call her names, and then stopped. Ilse had promised her father that she would try to break herself of the habit of calling names. She was making fairly good headway, and her conversation, if less vivid, was beginning to approximate New Moon standards. Emily made a sad mess of her lessons that day. She was nervous and frightened. She had a tremendous respect for Mr. Carpenter's opinion. Father Cassidy had told her to keep on. Dean Priest had told her that someday she might really write, but perhaps they were only trying to be encouraging because they liked her and didn't want to hurt her feelings. Emily knew Mr. Carpenter would not do this. No matter if he did like her, he would nip her aspirations mercilessly if he thought the root of the matter was not in her. If, on the contrary, he bade her Godspeed, she would rest content with that against the world, and never lose her heart in the face of any future criticism. No wonder the days seemed fraught with tremendous issues for Emily. When school was out, Mr. Carpenter asked her to remain. She was so white and tense that the other pupils thought she must have been found out by Mr. Carpenter in some especially dreadful behaviour, and knew that she was going to catch it. Rhoda Stewart flung her a significantly malicious smile from the porch. which Emily never even saw. She was indeed at a momentous bar, with Mr. Carpenter as supreme judge, and her whole future career, so she believed, hanging on his verdict. The pupils disappeared, and a mellowy, sunshiny stillness settled over the old schoolroom. Mr. Carpenter took the little packet she had given him in the morning out of his desk, came down the aisle and sat in the seat before her, facing her. Very deliberately he settled his glasses astride his hooked nose, took out her manuscripts, and began to read, or rather to glance over them, flinging scraps of comments mingled with grunts, sniffs, and hoots at her as he glanced. Emily folded her cold hands on her desk and braced her feet against the legs of it to keep her knees from trembling. This was a very terrible experience. She wished she had never given her verses to Mr. Carpenter. They were no good. Of course they were no good. Remember the editor of the Enterprise. Said Mr. Carpenter. Sunset. Lord, how many poems have been written on sunset? The clouds are massed in splendid state at heaven's unbarred western gate, where troops of star-eyed spirits wait. By gad, what does that mean? I don't know, faltered startled Emily, whose wits had been scattered by the sudden swoop of his spiked glance. Mr. Carpenter snorted. For heaven's sake, girl, don't write what you can't understand yourself. And this, to life. Life as thy gift, I ask no rainbow joy. Is that sincere? Is it, girl? Stop and think. Do you ask no rainbow joy of life? He transfixed her with another glare, but Emily was beginning to pick herself up a bit. Nevertheless, she felt suddenly oddly ashamed of the very elevated and unselfish desires expressed in that sonnet. No, she answered reluctantly. I do want rainbow joy, lots of it. Of course you do. We all do. We don't get it. We won't get it. But don't be hypocrite enough to pretend you don't want it, even in a sonnet. Lines to a mountain cascade, on its dark rocks like the whiteness of a veil around a bride. Where did you see a mountain cascade in Prince Edward Island? Nowhere. There's a picture of one in Dr. Burnley's library. A wood stream. The threading sunbeams quiver, the bending bushes shiver. Oh, the little shadowy river. There's only one more rhyme that occurs to me, and that's liver. Why did you leave it out? Emily writhed. Wind song. I have shaken the dew in the meadows from the clover's creamy gown. Pretty, but weak. June, for heaven's sake, girl, don't write poetry on June. It's the sickliest subject in the world. It's been written to death. No, June is immortal, cried Emily suddenly, a mutinous sparkle replacing the strained look in her eyes. She was not going to let Mr. Carpenter have it all his own way, but Mr. Carpenter had tossed June aside without reading a line of it. I weary of the hungry world. What do you know of the hungry world? You and your new moon seclusion of old trees and old maids. But it is hungry. Ode to winter. The seasons are a sort of disease all young poets must have, it seems. Ha! Spring will not forget. That's a good line. The only good line in it. Wanderings. I've learned the secret of the rune that the sombre pines on the hillside croon. Have you? Have you learned the secret? I think I've always known it, said Emily dreamily. That flash of unimaginable sweetness that sometimes surprised her had just come and gone. Aim and endeavour. Too didactic, too didactic. You've no right to try to teach until you're old, and then you won't want to. Her face was like a star, all pale and fair. Were you looking in the glass when you composed that line? No, she said indignantly. When the morning light is shaken like a banner on the hill. A good line, a good line. Oh, on such a golden morning to be living is delight. Too much like a faint echo of Wordsworth. The sea in September, blue and austerely bright. Austerely bright. Child, how can you marry the right adjectives like that? Morning. All the secret fears that haunt the night. What do you know of fears that haunt the night? I know something, said Emily decidedly, remembering her first night at Wither Grange. To a dead day, with the chilly calm on her brow that only the dead may wear. Have you ever seen the chilly calm on the brow of the dead, Emily? Yes, said Emily softly, recalling that grey dawn in the old house in the hollow. That was her father's death. I thought so, otherwise you couldn't have written that. And even as it is, how old are you, Jade? 13, last May? Huh. Lines to Mrs. George Irving's infant son. You should study the art of titles, Emily. There's a fashion in them as in everything. Your titles are as out of date as the candles of new moon. Soundly he sleeps with his red lips pressed like a beautiful blossom close to her breast. The rest isn't worth reading. September. Is there a month you've missed? Windy meadows, harvest deep. Good line. Blair water by moonlight. Gossamer, Emily. Nothing but gossamer. The garden of new moon. Beguiling laughter and old song of merry maids and men. Good line. I suppose new moon is full of ghosts. Death's fell minion well fulfilled its part. That might have passed in Addison's day, but not now, not now, Emily. Your azure dimples are the graves where million-buried sunbeams play. Atrocious, girl, atrocious! Graves aren't playgrounds. How much would you play if you were buried? Emily writhed and blushed again. Why couldn't she have seen that herself? Any goose could have seen it. Sorry. Sail onward, ships, white wings sail on, till past the horizon's purple bar you drift from sight. In flush of dawn, sail on aneath the evening star. Trash, trash, yet there is a picture in it. Lap softly purple waves I dream, and dreams are sweet. I'll wake no more. Ah, but you'll have to wake if you want to accomplish anything, girl. You've used purple twice in the same poem. Buttercups in a golden frenzy. A golden frenzy, girl. I see the wind shaking the buttercups. From the purple gates of the west I come. You're too fond of purple, Emily. It's such a lovely word, said Emily. Dreams that seem too bright to die. Seem, but never are, Emily. The luring voice of the echo, fame, so you've heard it, too. It is a lure, and for most of us only an echo, and that's the last of the lot. Mr. Carpenter swept the little sheets aside, folded his arms on the desk, and looked over his glasses at Emily. Emily looked back at him mutely, nervelessly. All the life seemed to have drained out of her body and concentrated in her eyes. 10 good lines out of 400, Emily. Comparatively good, that is. And all the rest, balderdash, Emily. I suppose so, said Emily faintly, Her eyes brimmed with tears, her lips quivered. She could not help it. Pride was hopelessly submerged in the bitterness of her disappointment. She felt exactly like a candle that somebody had blown out. "What are you crying for?" demanded Mr. Carpenter. Emily blinked away the tears and tried to laugh. I'm sorry you think it's no good," she said. Mr. Carpenter gave the desk a mighty thump. "No good? Didn't I tell you there were 10 good lines? Jade, for 10 righteous men Sodom had been spared." "Do you mean that, after all—" The candle was being relighted again. "Of course I mean. If at 13 you can write 10 good lines, at 20 you'll write 10 times 10, if the gods are kind. Stop messing over months, though, and don't imagine you're a genius either if you have written 10 decent lines. I think there's something trying to speak through you, but you'll have to make yourself a fit instrument for it. You've got to work hard and sacrifice. By gad, girl, you've chosen a jealous goddess. And she never lets her votaries go, not even when she shuts her ears forever to their plea. What have you got there?" Emily, her heart thrilling, handed him her Jimmy book. She was so happy that it shone through her whole being with a positive radiance. She saw her future, wonderful, brilliant. Oh, her goddess would listen to her. Emily B. Starr, the distinguished poet. Emily E. Bird Starr, the rising young novelist. This is in her mind. She was recalled from her enchanting reverie by a chuckle from Mr. Carpenter. Emily wondered a little uneasily what he was laughing at. She didn't think there was anything funny in that book. It contained only 3 or 4 of her latest stories: The Butterfly Queen, a little fairy tale; The Disappointed House, wherein she had woven a pretty dream of hopes come true after long years; The Secret of the Glen, which, in spite of its title, was a fanciful little dialogue between the spirit of the snow, the spirit of the grey rain, the spirit of mist, and the spirit of moonshine. "So you think I am not beautiful when I say my prayers?" said Mr. Carpenter. Emily gasped, realised what had happened, made a frantic grab at her Jimmy book, missed it. Mr. Carpenter held it beyond her reach and mocked at her. She had given him the wrong Jimmy book. And this one, oh horrors, what was in it? Or rather, what wasn't in it? Sketches of everyone in Blairwater, and a very full description of Mr. Carpenter himself. Intent on describing him exactly, she had been as mercilessly lucid as she always was, especially in regard to the odd faces he made on mornings when he opened the school day with a prayer. Thanks to her dramatic knack of word painting, Mr. Carpenter lived in that sketch. Emily did not know it, but he did. He saw himself as in a glass, and the artistry of it pleased him, so that he cared for nothing else. Besides, she had drawn his good points quite as clearly as his bad ones, and there were some sentences in it. He looks as if he knew a great deal that can never be of any use to him. I think he wears the black coat Mondays because it makes him feel that he hasn't been drunk at all. Who or what had taught the little jade these things? Oh, her goddess would not pass Emily by. "I'm sorry," said Emily, crimson with shame all over her dainty paleness. "Why, I wouldn't have missed this for all the poetry you've written, or ever will write. By gad, it's literature, literature! And you're only 13, but you don't know what's ahead of you, the stony hills, the steep ascents, the buffets, the discouragements. Stay in the valley if you're wise, Emily. Why do you want to write? Give me your reason." "I want to be famous and rich," said Emily coolly. "Everybody does. Is that all?" "No, I just love to write." "A better reason, but not enough." "Not enough. Tell me this, if you knew you would be as poor as a church mouse all your life, if you knew you'd never have a line published, would you still go on writing? Would you?" "Of course I would," said Emily disdainfully. "Why, I have to write. I can't help it by times. I've just got to." "Oh, then I'd waste my breath giving advice at all. If it's in you to climb, you must. There are those who must lift their eyes to the hills. They can't breathe properly in the valleys. God help them if there's some weakness in them that prevents their climbing. You don't understand a word I'm saying yet, but go on. Climb. There. Take your book and go home. 30 years from now I will have a claim to distinction in the fact that Emily Bird Starr was once a pupil of mine. Go before I remember what a disrespectful baggage you are to write such stuff about me, and be properly enraged." Emily went, still a bit scared, but oddly exultant behind her fright. She was so happy that her happiness seemed to irradiate the world with its own splendour. All the sweet sounds of nature around her seemed like the broken words of her own delight. Mr. Carpenter watched her out of sight from the old warm threshold. "Wind and flame and sea," he muttered. "Nature is always taking us by surprise. This child has what I have never had, and would have made any sacrifice to have. But the gods don't allow us to be in their debt. She will pay for it. She will pay." At sunset, Emily sat in the lookout room. It was flooded with soft splendour. Outside in sky and trees were delicate tintings and aerial sounds. Down in the garden, Daffy was chasing dead leaves along the red walks. The sight of his sleek striped sides, the grace of his movements gave her pleasure, as did the beautiful, even, glossy furrows of the ploughed fields beyond the lane, and the first faint white star in the crystal green sky. The wind of the autumn night was blowing trumpets of fairyland on the hills, and over in Lofty John's bush was laughter, like the laughter of fawns. Ilse and Perry and Teddy were waiting there for her. They had made a tryst for a twilight romp. She would go to them presently. Not yet. She was so full of rapture that she must write it out before she went back from her world of dreams to the world of reality. Once she would have poured it into a letter to her father. She could no longer do that. But on the table before her lay a brand new Jimmy book. She pulled it towards her, took up her pen, and on its first virgin page she wrote New Moon, Blairwater, P.E. Island, October 8th. I am going to write a diary that it may be published when I die. The end. There you go, the end of the book. Satisfying. He's not going to let her get away with badly written writing, but he will probably steer her a little bit to help her to increase her skills, to improve her use of words and language. So there you go. What did you think of that? That was a little bit different, wasn't it? Oh my goodness. So the next story we're going to be reading, and I have made this decision because nobody was talking to me about it, is called William Again. And I'm not reading it today, but it's the third book in the Just William series of books. Okay? So we're going to have a lot less heady, creative, writery sort of things. This one's more just a young lad who lives in southern England in a village with farmland around it and gets into lots of trouble for various reasons. Often it's just because adults say something and don't realise literally what they are saying, because we use figurative speech all the time. And so he gets into trouble because he takes things literally in a lot of situations. Sometimes he gets in trouble kind of on purpose, but it's mainly because there's a difference between how he sees the world and how adults see the world. So that will be a lot of fun. We shall get into that next time. It's Friday here in New Zealand at the moment, so that's probably going to be Monday. I don't think there's going to be anything else that'll distract me from it, but we'll see. I look forward to actually being with you again and reading some more, and I hope you've enjoyed Emily of New Moon. If you want more from Emily, there are 2 more books, and I'll leave you to find them and read them. I'm trying to think. I think they're on Project Gutenberg. I'll give you the link for that. No, I don't have a link for that one. I shall type out the link for you. There, Gutenberg.org. Gutenberg.org. Project Gutenberg. And it's public domain books. There's a whole lot in there. There's non-fiction and there's fiction, but they're mainly old books because they're out of copyright. But if you're wanting to follow up on the Emily book that we have just finished, Emily of New Moon, then the next one in the series is Emily Climbs. And there was a section of a poem that we had in this book which talked about, what did it talk about? I can't remember what it talked about, but it referenced what the titles of these next 2 books are. So there's Emily Climbs and then Emily's Quest. And they are Emily as she gets a little bit older, as she develops her skills with writing, and also as she relates to those around her, including the possibilities of boyfriends and so on like that. Yes, definitely a better link. I didn't realise I didn't have the command for it in the chat bot. I think I need to write that down, that I actually get that sorted. So I'm nearly finished here. Right, I've written that down so I can do something about it. I've got some other things like that I need to do too. So look forward to seeing you next time. You've got some homework to do if you wish to, if you want to find out more about Emily. It's up to you to read the rest of the books in the series. There are only 2 other books in this series. It's not as long a series, obviously, as the Anna Green Gables series. And next time I see you, we shall be reading William Again by Richmal Crompton, a lady who was a teacher and then became an author of mainly children's books, but she did write some other things as well. So looking forward to lots of nonsense. Oh, that's a good idea for your command. I need to put that in mine or something like that. Short commands are really good to have. I'm learning that. And it's lovely having you here. Gariki, that's fantastic to have you here. Let's have more fun with nonsense type stories. Well, no, they're actually not nonsense. Nonsense is more Edward Lear's verse. And things like Alice in Wonderland, that's a lot more nonsense. This is more mischief that we'll be reading about. I look forward to seeing you next time. I'm so glad you're able to catch some of it, even if you weren't able to catch all of it. So anyway, hopefully you'll be able to catch up on the rest of it if you didn't catch it all. And we shall see you next time, which is Monday for me. I read, if you're still new here and learning it, I read 3 days a week on Twitch TV, Monday, Wednesday, Friday, 3 p.m. New Zealand time, which if you actually go to my channel on Twitch, it will show you what it is in your time zone. So look forward to seeing you next time. In the meantime, happy reading. Bye.